Masechet Zevaḥim Daf Kof Yod Aleph. We're going to be dealing with the question of someone who pours water outside of the courtyard on Sukkot. Under what parameters will he be liable? Does he need 3 lugim of water like you would need for wine, or even less? And second question, does it have to be sanctified in a temple vessel first and then poured outside the courtyard in order to be liable? Or even if the water was not sanctified in a temple vessel, perhaps one is still liable. So we're going to see multiple badaitot that all are about this subject. First badaita, tenor banan. Hamenasech sheloshet lugin mayim behag bahutz hayav. Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon omer im mile'an l'shem hag hayav. The Tanakh Kama says if someone pours a libation of 3 lugim of water on the holiday of Sukkot outside of the courtyard, he is liable. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, said if he filled up a vessel with the water, with having in mind for the sake of the holiday libation, then he is liable. It's not really so clear what they are disagreeing about. And here we see 3 different interpretations. Mai benaihu, what would be a practical difference between these 2 opinions? Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, b'yesh shi'ur b'mayim kami palgeh. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says they're arguing about a case where there is a precise measured amount of water. Now, that itself is subject to multiple interpretations. We'll follow Rabbeinu Hananel here, who says that according to Tanakh Kama, you have to have 3 log. Any less than 3 log, not liable. Whereas Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon says even less than 3 log, one is liable as long as it was placed in a temple vessel. Even less than 3 log, one is liable. Rav Papa Amar bekarebu nesachim bamidbar pelige. Rav Papa says they're arguing about a different subject. This we will fully understand, and when we quote the next baraita. But just for now, the question is: were libations offered in the desert? The thing is, in the desert, they did not have service vessels. They did not have consecrated service vessels yet. And therefore, the question of if you need one or not depends on whether they made them in the desert. If you say that they did offer libations in the desert, that means they did so without temple vessels. And that would mean that you can make a libation without being consecrated vessel, and therefore you would be liable outside of the courtyard even without a vessel. So that would be Tanakh Kama says you're liable even without a vessel. That's Tanakh Kama. You can see his words as long as you have 3 lugim even without a vessel. Whereas Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon says that they did not offer libations in the desert, and that's because they didn't have temple vessels there. So they didn't have service vessels, and therefore they could not. And that would mean that you cannot offer a libation without a temple vessel. And therefore, if you offer a libation without a temple vessel outside of the courtyard, one is not liable because it's not valid. It's not valid inside, and therefore one is not liable outside. Okay, that's the second interpretation. We're going to get back to that one. Ravina Amar Bil Medin Nisuchamay Nisuchayayin Pelige. Ravina would be similar to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak in the interpretation of Rabbeinu Hananel. And he says, the question is, should we derive the laws of water libations from wine libations? So if you do, then you would say, just like wine libations, the smallest amount of a wine libation is 3 log, and therefore water libations also has to be 3 log. That would be the Tanakh Kama. Whereas Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, says, no, you do not learn one from the other, and although for wine libations the minimum is 3 log, for water libations, even less than that, one would be liable. All right, that's baraita number 1. Now, baraita number 2, same sages, similar topic, similar wording, and so it's probably a parallel baraita. Tenura banan hamenasech shelosha lugin yayin bahutz hayav. Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon omer vehu shekideshan b'kli. So Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon's language is a little bit different here, a little bit clearer. And according to Tanakama, if you have 3 lugim of libation outside, this is talking about wine now, outside, one is liable. Whereas, according to Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, it has to be consecrated in a service vessel. Otherwise, one is not liable. Mai benaihu, what is the difference between these two opinions? Amar Ravada bar Rav Yitzchak beruse midot ika benaihu. The difference between them is overfilling of measuring vessels. So this Braita also is going to have multiple interpretations. And so the first interpretation is they both agree that you need, according to this opinion, that you need to consecrate it in a service vessel. However, Tanakama says that, let's say you filled it to the rim and it's overflowing over the top, and all that overflow is at least 3 lugim, and you pour that outside of the courtyard, one is liable, even though that wine never actually went inside the vessel because it's overflowing. Nevertheless, you poured it on top, and that is considered a valid, that would be considered valid inside, so one is liable outside. However, the Rabbi Shimon says no. If it didn't go inside the vessel, then it was never consecrated, and therefore, if you do it outside the courtyard, then one is not liable. So that's interpretation of Rav Ada bar Rav Yitzchak. Rava bered Rabba Amar karbu nesachim babamaika benaihu. However, Rava, the son of Rabba, says the machloket between these two Tanaim here is whether nesachim, libations, wine libations, any libations, were brought, can be brought on a bama. That's the difference between them. And so you see that this interpretation, whether they were brought on a bama or not, this is at a time when private altars were permitted. People had it in your backyard. Wood and in bamot, there were no service vessels. So the question of whether or not nesachim were done on bamot is parallel to the question of whether nesachim were done in the desert. In both the desert and in private altars, they did not have service vessels. So, what you say about that, whether or not they had wine libations or water libations in these contexts, will affect the question of whether you need service vessels also when there is a Bet HaMikdash or not. And we will explain it as follows. So they're arguing about this. And this further, the machloket on this baraita between Tanakama and Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon further parallels a machloket in the following baraita. We'll explain this baraita, and then we'll go back and explain the previous one. The Tanya, Bamat Yachid ena siricha nesachim debrei Rabbi. Hachamim omrim teona nesachim. The private altar, private bama. There were multiple kinds of bamot. There was private ones that people had just in their backyard, more limited, and there were public ones, like in Gilgal, that was everybody would come to it. And there were certain times in history when these were permitted, but the laws of the private one and the public one are slightly different. According to the Biuda Nasi, a private bama, there's no nesachim there. You bring animals, but there's no need to bring wine libations. According to Chachamim, no, even the private ones need wine libations. Okay, so now let's start with Chachamim. Let's look at the consequences. In these private bamot, there was no service vessels, and yet wine libations were required. What you see from here is that a wine libation does not need a service vessel. Okay, therefore that's true in the future as well. A wine libation does not need a service vessel for it to be valid. And therefore, if one will pour a wine libation outside of the courtyard, even without a service vessel, he is liable. So that's it. The sages say they are liable. Whereas the Biuda Nasi says, no, in the private bamot, they did not do nesachim. They didn't have service vessels, and that would explain why they do not do nesachim. So therefore, you see that you need a service vessel in order for it to be a valid libation. Therefore, according to the Biuda Nasi, if one made a libation outside of the temple courtyard, but for sanctifying the wine in a service vessel, he would not be liable. Okay, once we see this, we can go back here and explain the same thing here. According to Tanakama, three lugim is sufficient. That's it. You just need 3 lugim. That's all you need. And it doesn't have to be sanctified in a service vessel. And therefore, if one pours 3 lugim outside of a temple courtyard, he is liable even without a service vessel. That would fit with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Whereas Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon would fit with the opinion of the sages. In the next baraita, he says, no, it has to be in a service vessel. Otherwise, it's no good. So these 2 Tanaim, according to Rava, the son of Rabbah, are arguing about whether nesachim are brought in a bama or not. And so, by interpreting it this way, now we have a parallel between the Tanakama here is like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, whereas Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon is like the Chachamim in this baraita over here. The Chachamim say Te'una Nesachim. Good. So now, so far, we see that these 2 baraitot are parallel to each other, and now we're going to bring yet another one, where we're going to see a machloket between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva that parallels this also. What we're going to see is that Rabbi Ishmael fits with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and Rabbi Akiva fits with the sages. So the Tanaim above, their machloket parallels the following machloket, the Tanya. Ki tabo'u lehat'inah nesachim babama gedola katu medaber. Pasuk that talks about the wine libations that are brought together as a accompaniment with animal offering says, when you come into the land, then you have to do this mitzvah, and so on. So why does it mean ki tavo'u? That means that we are requiring wine libations on a bama gedolah. When you come into the land, and you're going to make it in a place like Gilgal, a big bama, public one, then you're going to have to bring libations. Okay, so ki tavo'u. Now, in the Midrash Halacha, as is this typical style, it's going to question that thesis. Is that true only in a bama gedolah where they had service vessels, or maybe it's also true in a bama ketana where there were no service vessels? Keshu omer el eres moshe botechem asher ani noten lachem hare bama noheget lechul lechem hakatu medaber divrei Rabbi Ishmael. Well, and the rest of the pasuk, when it says, when I bring you in to the land of your dwelling that I'm going to give you. So here it's talking about the plural, that I'm giving all of you. So it must be talking about a bama that is available to everyone. That's only a public one. And therefore you see that the wine libations were required in a public bama, but not in a private bama. Why not in a private bama? Well, there's no service vessels in a private bama, so you can't do a libation without a service vessel. That means if you do a libation without a service vessel, it's not valid. And so if you would pour wine outside of the mikdash, outside of the courtyard, without a service vessel, Rabbi Ishmael would say, not liable, just like Rabbi in the previous baraita, just like Tanakama in the first baraita. Rabbi Akiva omer ki tabo'u latina nesachim babama ketana kod medaber. Rabbi Akiva learns the pesukim differently. He says that the word ki tabo, when you come, that means, and the context again is about wine libations that come with animal sacrifices. This pasuk requires to bring wine libations even on a bama ketana. And then, as is a typical style, we question the thesis. How do you know the pasuk is talking about a private bama? Maybe it's talking about a public altar. When it says to the land of your dwelling, so that means it's talking about a bama that is in any dwelling, anywhere, in a public place or in a private place, even in your backyard. So there you go. You see that this is talking about also a private one. And therefore, in a private, personal bama, where there are no service vessels, you still have to bring wine libations. That means you're bringing wine libations without the temple, without the consecrated vessels. That means you don't need a consecrated vessel to bring a proper libation. Therefore, if one brings a libation of wine even without a temple vessel outside of the courtyard, one would be liable to karet, according to Rabbi Rabbi Akiva. Kitchetim Salomar. Gemara now notes regarding this Baraita. When you look into it, you will find that L'divrei Rabbi Yishmael lo karbu nesachim bamidbar, L'divrei Rabbi Akiva karbu nesachim bamidbar. Because whatever you say about a bama of an individual, you will say also about the desert. And so according to Rabbi Yishmael, their wine libations were not offered in the desert because there were no service vessels. Whereas according to Rabbi Akiva, they did have wine libations in the desert because you don't need service vessels. Now we move on to the next part of the Mishnah that read, Rabbi Nechemia omer shiarei hadam shekriban bachutz hayav. And when you have a remainder of blood, you took the blood, you sprinkled it on the Mizbeach. It could be on the outer Mizbeach if it's an outer korban, or it could be on the inner Mizbeach if it's an inner korban in the hechal. Okay, and you sprinkled it inside and outside. You did all the sprinklings that are required. What do you do with the rest of the blood? So you're supposed to pour it onto the base of the mizbeach. And there's a machloket whether that is a mitzvah to do. I mean, it's good to do. You should do it. But if you didn't do it, it's not ma'akev. It doesn't ruin the korban. That's the majority opinion. But we're going to see that Rabbi Nechemia says that that's a required, it's its own right in and of itself, and it's required to do that. And therefore, since it's required, the flip side of that is that if you take the blood, the remainder blood, and pour it on a mizbeach outside of the courtyard, one would be liable according to Rabbi Nechemia. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Tana Rabbi Nechemia, Kedibrei ha'omer shirai me'akebin. Rabbi Yochanan says that the Rabbi Nechemia follows the opinion that says that the pouring of the leftover blood onto the base of the mizbeach is me'akev. It's required, and that's why you're liable if you do it outside. Other sages say, no, it's not. It's a mitzvah, but it's not required to do it inside. So since it's not a required thing to do inside, if you do it outside, you're not liable. Metibe. We have a challenge to this. Rabbi Nechemia omer shiarei hadam shekriban bachutz chayav. Here we can have a conversation. Rabbi Nechemia repeats the same thing that he says in the Mishnah, that the leftover of the blood, if you pour it outside of the courtyard, one is liable. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva v'lo shiarei hadam shiarei mitzvahem. Rabbi Akiva says, why should you be liable? The pouring out of the leftover of the blood is just an extra mitzvah. It's a leftover of a mitzvah. In other words, you did what you had to do. Now, this is a nice thing to do, but it's not me'akev, and therefore you should not be liable for pouring it outside the courtyard. Amar lo ebarinu fradin yochichu shen shiarei mitzvah v'hamekriban bachutz chayav. Rabbi Nechemia counters that the burning of the sacrificial limbs and fats of a korban, that is also a mitzvah. If one does that, if the kohen, he did everything correctly, he did shechita and the kabbalah and the holacha, and he sprinkled the blood on the mizbeach, and then they never burnt the fats and the kidneys and stuff, and they never burnt it, it would still be a valid korban. So you see that the burning of the sacrificial parts is not me'akev, and yet everybody agrees that if one would take those sacrificial parts and burn them on the mizbeach outside of the courtyard, one would be liable. And therefore, so too here, it doesn't matter whether something is required, is me'akev or not. Even here, something not me'akev, one is liable. So I could say the same thing about blood, that even if it's not me'akev, one is liable. It seems like he's arguing l'shitatcha. In other words, Rabbi Nechemia may very well say that it is liable, that me'akev is me'akev. If you have to put the blood on the ground. But his point here is that if you're going to argue that the pouring of the blood is not me'akev, well, I'll bring you something else that's also not me'akev, and that you would agree that if you did it outside, one would be liable. Amar lo im amarte be'ebarim ufradim shen techilat avodah tomar b'shiarei hadam shenan techilat avodah. And Rabbi Akiva says back, no, you can't compare the two. You can't compare the burning of the sacrificial parts, which is a right in and of itself. It's from a beginning to end. You take, you did the blood, You sprinkle that. That's a separate thing. And now you're taking the sacrificial parts, fats, and you're putting it on the mizbech. So that's a new service. And because it's a new activity, that's why if you do it outside, it's its own entity, and you'd be liable. But you can't compare that to the leftover of the blood, where that's not the beginning of a sacrificial rite. The sacrificial rite starts when you're getting the blood and sprinkling the blood, but then now it's just continuing. It's just the leftover. This is the added part that you do after you sprinkle the main thing. So this is continuing that. It's not its own right, therefore it's not as significant. So Rabbi Akiva is consistent with his own opinion. He thinks that the burning of the sacrificial parts and the blood, pouring the leftover blood, both are not me'akev. And yet there's a difference, because the sacrificial parts is a activity in and of itself from beginning to end, and therefore that's significant. And if you do that outside of the courtyard, would be liable. But the leftover of the blood is just an extra credit mitzvah, and therefore one is not liable. Okay, Rabbi Nechemiah, however, he disagrees, and he says that it is required. Now we ask, we wonder, how come Rabbi Nechemiah has no answer to Rabbi Akiva over here? Rabbi Akiva is making an understandable distinction. Rabbi Nechemiah, he started off good, and he said, oh, it's required. Rabbi Akiva shifted the conversation. He says, no, Sheireh Hadam is only a mitzvah. And now, Rabbi Nechemiah, why didn't he answer him and say, no, I disagree, it's not a Sheireh Hadam mitzvah? In other words, this whole baraita is a challenge to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of Rabbi Nechemiah, that the pouring of the leftover is me'akev, because he doesn't say anything about that in this baraita. He should have responded to Rabbi Akiva with an answer. Now, even if you want to say in the middle here, Rabbi Nechemiah is saying l'shitatcha. Okay, I'll even follow you to say that blood is a mitzvah, but the sacrificial parts are also a mitzvah. So therefore, Rabbi Nechemiah is saying that's the same. Okay, it's a good comeback. Rabbi Akiva says no, they're different. One's the whole right in and of itself, one's a continuation. Here, Rabbi Akiva should not have kept quiet. If he thought that pouring of the leftover blood is me'akev, he should have said, no, there's a fundamental difference. It is me'akev. So why didn't he say that? Tiyufta, you know what? It really is a good question. So we don't know how Rabbi Nechemiah would reconcile his interpretation of Rabbi Nechemiah with the lack of such a statement in this baraita, where it doesn't seem that Rabbi Nechemiah thinks it is me'akev. He seems to be agreeing with Rabbi Akiva that blood is not me'akev. He just thinks that they should be the same, even though they're both not me'akev. They're both nice things to do, mitzvah to do, so he thinks they're the same. So you could interpret it Nechemiah differently than Rabbi Yochanan. Not that the blood is me'akev, but because even if it's just a mitzvah, doing it outside is would bring you karet, just like the sacrificial parts, and he disagrees with this distinction between Rabbi Akiva. So that would be a simpler way of explaining Rabbi Nechemiah without having to assume that he thinks that sheirayim me'akevin. So indeed, that is a serious challenge against Rabbi Yochanan. בהשתד אמר רב עדה בר אהבה מחלוקת בשיריים הפנימיים אבל בשיריים החיצוניים דברי הכל למעכבי. But now we actually just learned that a statement of Rav Ada bar Ahava that says the machloket between the Tanaim about whether you have to pour the remainder of the blood out or not, whether it's ma'akev or not, that whole machloket is actually only about the leftover of blood that was sprinkled inside, like for Yom Kippur. It was sprinkled inside, and now you still have leftover. So you sprinkled it inside, outside, and now you have leftover. That's the blood that there is an opinion that says that it's me'akev, you have to pour it on the base, otherwise the whole thing is no good. But everyone agrees that if it's an outside korban, a korban that's sprinkled only on the outside of mizbeach and doesn't go in the mizbeach, inside mizbeach at all, everybody agrees that it's not me'akev. Once you say this, then actually we have a better resolution to the question that we just asked, the tiyuvta, against Rabbi Yochanan. Ki kama Rabbi Nechemiah b'shirayim hapinimim. When Rabbi Nechemiah says in the Mishnah that shirayim, that one pours outside of the temple, outside of the courtyard, one is liable. That's talking about blood that had been sprinkled inside. And the blood that's sprinkled inside, Rabbi Nechemia follows the opinion that says that's me'akev. You have to pour that on the base of the Mizbeach. Since you have to pour on the base of the Mizbeach, if you bring it outside, one is liable. Whereas the other Baraita, Kitanyahi b'shirayim hachisonim, the Baraita about the conversation between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Nechemia, that was talking about blood from an outside mizbeach, where it was not necessary to put that on the base. And there, actually, Rabbi Nechemia would agree that since it's not necessary, if you bring it outside, then you're not liable. So actually, in that case, Rabbi Nechemia is in agreement with Rabbi Akiva. Now, what about that conversation? Because it looks like they were disagreeing. The thing is, they were cross-talking. Rabbi Akiva did not know that Rabbi Nechemia was only giving his halacha for an inside mizbeach, a korban that's sprinkled on the inside. Rabbi Akiva thought that Rabbi Nechemia said that even for a korban that is sprinkled on the outside, even there you would be liable if you sprinkle that blood, if you pour that blood outside. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva was giving a response that would be appropriate because he's comparing the sacrificial parts that are brought on the outside and are not necessary to the leftover blood from an outside korban, which is also not me'akev. So it makes sense that he was bringing those statements. When Rabbi Nechemia was responding, he was responding l'shitatcha of Rabbi Akiva. He was just giving a back and forth to Rabbi Nechemia. But indeed, there was actually a miscommunication between them, and Rabbi Akiva thought that Rabbi Nechemia would say that the outside korban is me'akev, but in fact, Rabbi Nechemia never said that the outside korban is me'akev, and so therefore, there was no need for them to disagree, and in that case, we can understand that the statement in the Mishnah, along with the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, that was all talking about the inner korban. And there, yes, indeed, Rabbi Nechemia says that it's me'akev, and therefore, if one does it outside, one is liable, but only in that case of an inner korban. The next Mishnah teaches, Hamolek et ha'of bifnim vehela b'chutz chayav, malak b'chutz vehela b'chutz patur. If someone does milika on a bird inside of the courtyard, which is the proper thing to do in the courtyard, and then sacrificed it outside the courtyard, he is liable, because he prepared it properly and then sacrificed it outside. So it's an otherwise proper sacrifice, but then you're burning it outside, so then you'd be liable to karet. However, if he did milika outside of the temple courtyard and then offered it outside the temple courtyard, he is not liable, because milika is not the proper way of killing a bird outside outside of the courtyard, and therefore that act, since it's already improper, is not a valid korban, and burning something that's not a valid korban is patur. Hashochet et ha'of bifnim ve'ela b'chutz patur, shachat b'chutz ve'ela b'chutz chayav. And now the opposite case, if someone does shechita on a bird inside and then burns it outside, patur, because shechita inside the courtyard is not the proper way to kill a bird inside the courtyard, and therefore it's invalid. And then when he burns it outside, he's patur because he's burning something that's invalid. But on the other hand, if he does shechita outside and then burns it outside, since shechita is the proper way to kill a bird outside, when he does that and then offers it outside, he is liable to karet. Nimsa, we have a summary statement. Derech hechshero bifnim, pituro b'chutz. Derech hechshero mi b'chutz, pituro bifnim. The way of making it kosher inside, meaning milika, if you would do that outside and burn it outside, it would be patur. Whereas the way of making a bird kosher outside, that's shechita, if you do that inside and you do shechita inside the courtyard, then burn it outside, he would be patur. Gemara will have a note on this language of hechshero versus pituro. It doesn't seem to be opposite. The opposite of pituro would be chiyuvo. So the Gemara will talk about that. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon disagrees with Tanakama, but the language that he uses is very vague. And the Gemara is going to try to figure out what exactly is he disagreeing about. But we'll read it. Kol shechayavin ala bachutz chayavin al kayose bo bifnim she'ela bachutz. Chutz min hashochet bifnim u'ma'aleh bachutz. Anytime you would be liable if you did this something outside the courtyard, one is liable for doing that same thing inside the courtyard and then burning it outside the courtyard, except for doing shechita inside and then burning it outside. Shechita would fit into the criteria here. It's something that if you did shechita outside, then and you burnt it outside, you would be liable. But if you did it inside and then burned it outside, there's something that would be liable. It's not shechita. So shechita inside and then burning it outside is patur. But there's some other case that Rabbi Shimon says is chayav, and he's disagreeing with Tanakama. It's not going to be easy to find something that fits into this wording. In the end, we're going to have to change the wording or add another case. Okay, hi hechshero chiyuvo. Why does it say in the summary statement hechshero? It should see that which makes him liable, and then that would read better. Something that makes him liable if he does it inside will make him not liable if he does it outside, and something that makes him liable if he does it outside, meaning shechita, if he does it inside, he will not be liable. Isn't chiyuvo better? And so the answer is taneh chiyuvo. Yes, okay, change the word to chiyuvo. I mean, the word works with hechshera because there's a parallel. Anything that would be valid for a korban inside also makes it liable if you take it outside. And opposite, anything that is not a valid korban inside, if you burn it outside, is also not going to be valid. So really both languages work, but the chiyuvo is better as the opposite of pituro. Rabbi Shimon Omer, ahecha ka'eh. When Rabbi Shimon disagrees with the Tanakama, which statement is he talking to that he disagrees about? Ilema aresha ka'eh. Let's try out everything. Let's try out the resha. The resha read, hamolek off bifnim behela bachutz chayav. Malak bachutz ve'ela bachutz patur. If you did milika inside, which is the right thing to do, and then you burned it outside, hayab, because that's a valid korban. Whereas if you did milika outside and then burnt it outside, patur, because that's invalid. That's Tanakama. V'amar Rabbi Shimon ki hechi depnim mechayev bachutz nami mechayev. And so maybe Rabbi Shimon is disagreeing about that and saying, just like doing milika inside would make him liable, so too, doing milika outside and burning it outside also would be liable. Okay, that is a logical thing to say. Could be he's disagreeing with that. The problem is it doesn't fit the words precisely because Hai kol shechayavin ala bachutz, kol shechayavin ala bifnimi ba'eleh. The language in the Mishnah as we have it is anything for which you are liable if you do it outside. Then also you're liable if you do it inside. But according to this, it should read anything that you're liable if you do it inside. That's milika. If you do it outside, you'll also be liable. So that's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah should say shukavin ala bifnim, but doesn't say that, and therefore we reject this. Remember this one because we're going to come back to this interpretation at the end, and in fact we're going to say we need to change the language of Rabbi Shimon to kol shechavin ala bifnim. Okay, so hold on to that. But in the meantime, we'll try everything else to try our best to explain the language as is. Ela ki hechi de bachutz la mechayev bifnim nami la lichayev. Perhaps it means just like outside, milika outside is not liable because milika is the wrong thing to do outside. Perhaps also if you do milika inside and then burn it outside, one is not liable, even though milika is the right thing to do inside. That's if you're burning it inside also, all in the proper way. But milika inside and then you're taking it outside. Perhaps that's not the way that you kill something that's outside and you're burning it outside. So maybe one would be patur. Maybe that's what Rabbi Shimon is saying. He disagrees with Tanakama about that. No, that also doesn't fit because kol she'en chayavin ala bachutz miba'eleh. In that case, instead of saying kol she'chayavin ala bachutz, the language of the Mishnah should say anything for which one is not liable outside, because that would mean anything you're not liable outside, meaning milika. Melika, you're not liable outside, and then therefore you're also not liable if you do Melika inside and burn it outside. That's what the Mishnah should have said. Mishnah doesn't say that. It says Kol shechayvin ala bachutz. So we reject this one. Ela asefa kai. Let's try that applying Rabbi Shimon to the next case. Hashochet off bifnim ve'ela bachutz patur shachat bachutz ve'ela bachutz chayav. The Tanna Kama taught that if someone did shechita on a bird inside and brought it and burnt it outside, patur, because shechita is not the right way to kill an animal inside. But if you do shechita outside and burn it outside, the chayav, because that is the proper way. V'amar le Rabbi Shimon, ki hechi de bifnim la mechayev, bachutz nami la mechayev. And then Rabbi Shimon argues and says, just like inside, doing shechita inside, one is not liable if he burns it outside. So too, even doing shechita outside and burning it outside is not liable because shechita is not the way you prepare korban. And he's treating this like a korban. And therefore, korban, you don't do shechita. So maybe even if you do shechita outside and burn it outside, maybe he would not be liable. Okay, it's a logical thing to say, but again, this doesn't fit the Mishnah's language. Hai kol she'en chayavin mi ba'aleh should say anything for which one is not liable if when he does it on the inside is also not liable on the outside. But the Mishnah didn't say that. It said kol she'chayavin alav bachutz. It should say kol she'en chayavin alav bachutz. Ela ki hechi de bachutz mechayev bifnim name mechayev. Rather, perhaps Rabbi Shimon is arguing on this clause, but he's saying that just like outside, one is liable for doing shechita outside, so too, if you do shechita inside and burn it outside, also one is liable, since you're going to end up burning it outside. So we treat shechita as the proper way, even though you're doing it inside. But that can't be because ha'katane chutz mina shochet bifnim v'amale bachutz. That's the one case that Rabbi Shimon explicitly says, except for if you do shechita inside and then burn it outside, then he is exempt. In other words, he agrees with Tanna Kama on that one. So it can't be he disagrees on that point. All right, we went through every possibility, and none of them fit the language of the Mishnah. So we'll try a couple more answers. Amar Zeiri, shechitat behema balayla ika benayu. Actually, there's another case that we have to add into the Mishnah, and that is doing shechita over an animal, not a bird now, an animal at night. And you can't do shechita, not on a bird or an animal. You can't do any shechita in the Bet HaMikdash at night. No, it won't be valid as a proper korban. And here's what he says. V'hachi kamar. V'chen hashochet behema bifnim balayla ve'ela bachutz patur shachat bachutz balayla ve'ela bachutz chayav. We're adding another clause to the Mishnah where Tanna Kama says, and also if someone does shechita on an animal inside at night, well, that's not invalid. So if you burn that outside, patur. But if you do shechita outside at night, you're allowed to do shechita for chulin outside at night. You can, if you want to eat a hamburger at night, you could do shechita at night. That's no problem. And so since shechita is valid at night outside, if one does that and then burns it outside, he is liable. That fits with the same methodology of Tanna Kama as before. That's where Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kol shechayvin ala bachutz, chayvin al kayoseh bo bifnim, ve'ela bachutz, chutz min hashochet off bifnim, ve'ela bachutz. So Rabbi Shimon says, any case where one is liable outside, meaning if you do shechita at night, and you burn it outside, you're liable. So too, you would be liable if you do that same thing, do shechita at night, inside, and then burn it outside. The only exception is doing shechita on a bird inside and taking it outside. Okay, that's the one thing he disagrees with. That's one thing he has an exception to this rule, and he says he agrees with Tanna Kama and would say patur. But regarding doing it at night, he disagrees with Tanna Kama. Tanna Kama says patur if you do it at night inside, and Rabbi Shimon says he is liable if he does shechita at night inside and burns it outside. That fits the language of Rabbi Shimon. It's true we have to add a whole other clause to the Tanna Kama, but okay, at least maybe we're missing a clause. That could happen. And Rabbi Shimon is responding to that. Rava Amar, Kabbalah b'kli chol ika benayhu. Rava says, no, a different case. If someone, the Kohen, does receiving of the blood in a non-sacred vessel, the receiving of the blood has to be in a sacred vessel for a proper korban. And so what if he does it in a non-sacred vessel? Hachi ka'amar, v'chen ha'mekabel b'kli chol b'fnim be'ela b'chutz patur. Ha'mekabel b'kli chol b'chutz ve'ela b'chutz chayav. Again, we're adding a whole clause to the Mishnah. Tanna Kama says, And so too, if someone receives the blood in a non-holy vessel inside, that would make an inside, a regular korban, improper, invalid. And so if he takes that and burns it outside, then he's patur because it's an invalid korban. But if he receives it in a klechol outside and he burns it outside, then he is liable. That's Tanakama, following their methodology as usual. Rabbi Shimon omer, kol shechavin ala bachutz chavin ala al kayoseh bo bifnim ve'lo bachutz, chutz min hashochet of bifnim ve'lo bachutz. And Rabbi Shimon disagrees on this case and says, anytime a person would be liable outside, so that means if he receives it in a non-sacred vessel outside, he is liable for burning it outside. So too, if he receives it in a non-sacred vessel inside and burns it outside, he is liable. And that's true for this case. That's what's coming to include. And Rabbi Shimon, however, agrees with Tanakama when it comes to doing shechita of a bird inside and then burning it outside, that he is not liable, as like Tanakama says. That also fits with the wording of Rabbi Shimon. Although again here we have to add in a whole clause to the Mishnah. But now we're going to go back all the way to the first proposal. Hashtad detane abu de Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak. Hamolek of bifnim ve'elo bachutz chayav. Malak bachutz ve'ela bachutz patur. Rabbi Shimon mechayev. The father of Shmuel bar Yitzchak brought a baraita. We didn't know this baraita before. Not everybody knows every baraita. Baraitas are memorized in different schools by different people. And so now he taught us this baraita. This baraita is parallel to our Mishnah and clarifies the Mishnah. So this baraita teaches that if someone does milika on a bird inside, that's the proper way, and then burns it outside, he's liable, for sure. And if he does milika outside and burns it outside, patur. That's Tanakama, same as in our Mishnah. But Rabbi Shimon says he is liable for doing milika outside and burning it outside, since milika is a way of doing a sacrifice, and this guy's trying to do a sacrifice outside, he is liable. So now we know from this baraita that Rabbi Shimon, in fact, is disagreeing with this case at the beginning of the Mishnah. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon hatam ka'eh uteneh kol shechayvin ala bifnim ve'ela bachutz chayvin ala bachutz. Rabbi Shimon therefore is arguing on that case in the Resha, and therefore we have to change the words of the Mishnah and have it read, anytime one is liable inside, meaning if you do milika inside and burn it outside, you're liable. One's liable. So too, if you do that same thing, milika outside and burn it outside, one would also be liable. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.